Thank you, Rosemary, for that very warm welcome. Before I begin, though, please let me acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we gather today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And in that vein, I want to also acknowledge a couple of my parliamentary colleagues that are sitting among you. Of course, the lovely Sheena Watt, who is our most newly elected or appointed Member of Parliament, recently taking up the Northern Victoria, or Northern Metro rather, Victoria Upper House position, and our first Aboriginal Labor Party member in Victoria, and a wonderful addition to our Parliament and to our party. So welcome, Sheena. She was also somewhat strong-armed into being here today after I ear-bashed her about this presentation and my passion for Irish history, and so she's been eager to hear what this enthusiasm is all about. So thanks for being a friend and a sister, Sheena. And we also have here John Kennedy, our member for Hawthorn, who may be known to many of you. I think he's also the co-convener of the Parliamentary Friends of Ireland, and certainly one of the funniest members of our government and caucus, but also a man that brings such depth of knowledge and passion, both in terms of Irish affairs and many others as well. So thank you for being here, John, as well. Of course, we've got our Irish ambassador, the wonderful Brendan O'Queely, who is somebody I'm getting to know more gradually the more Irish events I attend, and he's a great advocate for Ireland here, but also a great supporter of Irish events here and of Irish Australia. So thank you for the role that you play. Our Brigid Fest committee, these things take a lot of work to put on, and I know that we've been in discussion about this for the best part of a year. So I do want to pay my respects and give thanks to those who have poured their heart and soul into this today. I also want to acknowledge our Brigidine sisters who are here, and the great project which many of you will be aware of, which is our Brigidine Asylum Seeker project that I believe funds will go towards. And I couldn't move forward, and I will shortly in the substance of my speech, but without acknowledging Val Noon, who is here, because if it wasn't for Val, who taught me Irish history at Melbourne University before I then took off to Monash. If it wasn't for Val, I wouldn't be in my 17th year of a love affair with Ireland that has been a one constant throughout my life, and in all roles I've fulfilled. So thank you, Val, for passing on your passion to me and to so many others too through the university sector. So look, it's a great pleasure to be here for Brigid Fest this year, and of course it's Brigid Fest's coming of age, 18. So it feels more special to be here this year of all years, and it is wonderful that it can be an in-person event after such a challenging time. A year that has seen a disproportionate share of the social and economic hardship weigh on the shoulders of women being the majority of frontline workers, women who have taken on an even greater share of unpaid caring and domestic responsibilities, women who disproportionately bear the physical and psychological bruises of violence in the home, women who have disproportionately lost jobs as a product of the fact that we were already overrepresented in low-paid, insecure work. So against that backdrop, any celebration of women has a special significance this year, although we might all agree it shouldn't take a global crisis for that to be the case. The opportunity to speak today allows me to bring together a few personal and professional loves: the role of women in women's movements, Irish history and politics, and a particular academic interest I've long harboured in resistance movements, in conflict resolution and in counterinsurgency. So thank you for allowing me this opportunity to roll around in these many passions and take you on a journey that I hope is interesting. I also think it's fitting that I'll be giving this address in a year that will commemorate 100 years since the partition of Ireland and 40 years since the 1981 hunger strike in which 10 men died. I'm quite certain of one thing. In the media coverage, in the historical reflections, the books, the documentaries, in our social media feeds, the voices of men and men's stories will dominate. We'll hear at length about Collins and De Valera, we'll hear about James Craig and Edward Carson, we'll hear about Bobby Sands and, to a lesser extent, the other 9 hunger strikers who died in 1981, Francis Hughes, Raymond McCreish, Patsy O'Hara, Joe McDonnell, Martin Herson, Kevin Lynch, Kieran Doherty, Thomas McElwee and Mickey Devine. We'll hear about and from men of cloth, and we will hear about institutions of power dominated by men. Granted, Thatcher will get a mention, and I wager Constance Markovich will too, Two women, players on a stage in the same production but in different acts, opposite sides in the same long struggle, although generations apart. But aside from a few prominent individuals, we're unlikely to hear very much about female contribution, particularly the centrality of female contribution to the Irish Republican movement, whether that be in the first quarter of the 20th century or indeed in the last quarter of the 20th century. So in a year when men's voices and men's stories will dominate, I'm humbled to play a small part in what I hope is a much bigger effort to elevate women's stories and women's voices. And I think it's important to challenge the stereotypes, to build a fuller understanding of the role of women, even if that means challenging our tendency to look upon women exclusively as Madonna figures, as life givers and as nurturers. So in the interest of balancing time and a desire for substance, I'm going to concentrate my discussion today on the role of women in the last quarter of the 20th century, with a particular focus on the period covering the prison protests in Long Kesh and Armagh Women's Jail from 1976 to 81. Now, this followed the British government's removal of special category or political prisoner status for those who were convicted of offences related to the conflict. So for those who may not be familiar with this period of protest, it started when prisoners refused to wear the prison uniform and went naked into their cells with only a prison blanket to cover them. This became known as the blanket protest, and it escalated into a no-wash protest in 1978 when prisoners objected to having to toilet and wash in their cells rather than in the ablutions area with its proper showers and toilets. Refusal to wash in their cells saw authorities refuse to allow prisoners to slop out and empty their chamber pots. As a consequence, prisoners attempted unsuccessfully to empty their pots out of cell windows and under doors. In a further escalation, prison authorities then removed all furniture bar a foam mattress from the cells. To mitigate against the smell of piled up faeces and to cause some extra hassle for authorities, prisoners began to smear their faeces in thin layers across their cell walls in images now made famous. This continued until March 1981 and culminated in a hunger strike. The no-wash protest has become synonymous with Long Kesh Prison, also known as the Maze, and many of you may know it by that name, but was also carried out in Armagh Women's Jail, which might be less widely known. In fact, it certainly is less widely known. So in honour of St Brigit the Weaver, I want to weave a few threads together today, and I hope it does her justice. I want to talk about gender equality in the Irish Republican movement and feminism on the outside. I want to talk about the unique experiences of female volunteers, their omission from mainstream understanding and the consequences of that. I want to talk about women as supporters, as facilitators and as messengers. I want to talk about the crucial importance of these functions to the Republican movement and the personal cost. I want to talk about mothers, sisters and wives. And in doing all of this, I want to, wherever possible, let these women speak for themselves by drawing on their accounts. The conventional understanding and mainstream depiction of women in resistance movements in some respects typically emphasises the weaponisation of their femininity, women as honey traps, using their feminine wiles to lure soldiers to their death. Our mainstream understanding also accommodates women as harbourers and transporters of weapons, a task that relies upon ingrained gender stereotypes that assume innocence and purity in order to avoid suspicion. And of course, the Irish Republican movement took full advantage of these stereotypes. Whether she's luring a soldier to a rendezvous or tucking an Armalite under the baby's bedclothes in a pram, or if she's providing food, clothing and shelter to young men on the run, which many women did, these roles don't particularly challenge the dominant understanding of gender roles and attributes. They put women at the fringes in our understanding, presenting their involvement as somewhat incidental or peripheral, and to some extent diminishing the agency of these women in their participation. In this sense, women as honey traps or caregivers or couriers is a safer or more comfortable understanding of women in the context of violence. Although it's worth noting that these seemingly peripheral roles were pivotal to operational success and, as I'll explain later, also critical in the battle of hearts and minds. What is undoubtedly less comfortable in mainstream consciousness is the role of women as willing, committed and strategic perpetrators of violence. And it must be said, it's not only commentators and observers who are guilty of finding relative safety in these traditional constructs. Let's not forget that the Republican movement itself had to undergo changes in order to more fully incorporate into its structures and operations the active participation of women. This meant moving away from segregated structures towards one single entity that included women in all parts of guerrilla operations. What's clear is that these changes were driven from the ground up. In 1982, in an edition of On for Blocked, or Republican News, as some of you may know it, a female IRA volunteer stated, "When I first joined the movement, I was incumbent among, but I wasn't content with the limited contribution which I thought it offered me. I wanted to fully participate in operations. As a woman revolutionary, I believe that our liberation as women must go hand in hand alongside the arms struggle. So for me, I find it somewhat contradictory to have a separate organisation solely for women when the IRA seemed the most direct channel, so I joined it." Mairead Farrell, who was later killed in an IRA operation in Gibraltar, stated in an interview that she was attracted to the IRA because she was treated the same as the lads. But we know that isn't entirely true. For example, when the blanket protest in Long Kesh escalated into the No Wash protest, Republican women in Armagh, including Mairead Farrell herself, had a hard time convincing the men in the Republican movement that they should also be allowed to join the protest. The conditions within Long Kesh during the No Wash protest were notoriously putrid and confronting. Excrement smeared across the walls, piles of rotting food in cell corners, and maggots in abundance. The thoughts of women aged on average between 19 and 22 enduring similar conditions clearly challenged traditional notions of gender for men in the movement. The real sticking point, however, was apparently menstruation. The men who were liaising with the women prisoners in Armagh were allegedly too embarrassed to say so directly, but according to author Eileen MacDonald, following her interviews with a number of the women who were in Armagh, the men were worried that infections would occur if women did not wash when they were bleeding. She goes on to note, though, that the women stood firm and the men capitulated in the end. The same happened when the decision was made by male prisoners in Long Kesh to embark upon the first hunger strike in 1980. The women in Armagh again decided they would follow suit and join the fast, causing the movement outside to object in no uncertain terms. Again, the movement was overruled by the women themselves, and 3 women from Armagh joined the first hunger strike: Mairead Farrell, Mairead Nugent and Mary Doyle. There have also been claims by some lower-ranking female volunteers that they had to work much harder than men to prove themselves, and I'm pretty sure that's something many women across our community might be able to relate to. But what we can say with certainty is that while women may not have participated in violent activities in the same numbers as men, they certainly participated with the same fervour. The 3 hunger strikers in Armagh, for example. Mary Doyle was convicted of causing an explosion on a bridge over the M2 motorway. Mairead Nugent was sentenced to 25 years for blowing up the home of a prison governor. Mairead Farrell attempted to plant a bomb at the Conway Hotel in Dunmurray. I could list other examples: the Belfast-born sisters Dolores and Marion Price, who participated in a London bombing campaign in 1973, or Jennifer McCann, who shot an RUC police officer in 1980, or former beauty queen Martina Anderson, now an elected Sinn Féin representative, who was given a life sentence for her role in a bombing plot, and I could list others, many of them. Maura Drum, the highest-ranking woman in the IRA and one-time Sinn Féin president, once famously said, "We have levelled Belfast before and will do it again if necessary. We'll never stop until we get what we want, and if our men are prevented from doing it, the women will do it for them." Perhaps unsurprisingly, public commentary about these women either depicted them as traitors to their gender or lent into more unflattering characterisations of femininity. For example, in 1975, the Sunday World described women prisoners in Limerick as caged cats. It's also worth noting that for most female Republican volunteers, a decision to join the movement and participate in violent activity was not a feminist statement at all. However, the experience of involvement seems to have developed a feminist consciousness among many of them. In 1990, while still in Armagh Women's Jail, a then 30-year-old Jennifer McCann reflected that prior to her incarceration, she regarded herself as a feminist in a vague sort of way because she was by and large independent. But she then went on to reflect on the development of this consciousness over time, saying, "When I was on the outside, I thought that we could wait until we had won the battle and got our own state before we sorted out women's rights. Now I see there's only one way. Now I see there is no way that we can wait for that. Fighting the oppression of women must go together with the Republican fight. If we leave it till afterwards, we could lose it." This was by no means a uniform view. Mairead Farrell, for example, outlined an alternative position. She said, "I'm oppressed as a woman, but I'm also oppressed because I'm Irish. Everyone in this country is oppressed, and we can't successfully end our oppression as women until we first end the oppression of our country." She did, however, believe that women needed to play a prominent part in the movement for equality to be achieved, and so in this sense, the point of disagreement was about prioritisation, not about the overall objective. Perhaps even more interesting is the change that became evident in the Republican movement as a whole in relation to gender equality and the promotion of a greater understanding of women's issues and women's rights. By the late 80s, men in the age blocks of Longkesh were taking classes in feminism and in childcare. And as Jennifer McCann reflected in 1990, she said, "You wouldn't have caught them doing that a few years ago, they would have been horrified." And as an aside though, the movement's position on issues like women's reproductive rights and a range of other frontline feminist issues were a bit slower to shift, but I won't get into that today. So how did the fast-rising global feminist movement regard the efforts of women like Mary Farrell, Jennifer McCann and other active Republican volunteers and feminists? I think the short answer to that question is with discomfort and trepidation. This was perhaps most visible during the No Wash protest in Armagh Women's Jail. If you would indulge me for a moment, I'd like to read at length an article written by former Irish Times journalist Nell McCafferty on the 22nd of August in 1980. And it appeared under the headline, "It is my belief that Armagh is a feminist issue." And in it, McCafferty writes this: "There is menstrual blood on the walls of Armagh Prison in Northern Ireland. The 32 women on dirt strike there have not washed their bodies since February the 8th, 1980. They use their cells as toilets. For over 200 days now, they have lived amid their own excreta, urine and blood. The windows and spire holes are boarded up. Flies and slugs grow fat as they grow thin. They eat and sleep and sit in this dim, electrically lit filth without reading materials or radio or television. They are allowed out 1 hour per day, hopefully to stand in the rain. The consequences for these women under these conditions will be, at the least, urinary, pelvic and skin infections. At worst, they face sterility and possible death. They are guarded by male warders, presided over by a male governor and attended by a male doctor. Relations between the women and these men have never been very good. In an ordinary medical atmosphere, in, for example, a Dublin hospital, women who have depended on men for advice, consultation and treatment have often had grounds for complaint. In the present situation of confrontation and hostility that exists in Armagh Jail, it would be fair to assume that the relationship between the women prisoners and the men charged with responsibility for them is not such as to allay anxiety about the bodily health of the women. What business, if any, is it of ours? The choice for feminists on the matter of Armagh Jail are clear-cut. We can ignore these women or we can express concern about them." She goes on to outline the case of a particular prisoner admitted to the intensive care unit of Belfast Hospital after experiencing extreme weight loss. McCafferty says, "What is to be done? Shall we feminists record that she is inflicting the conditions on herself in case any question of moral dereliction arises against us? The menstrual blood on the walls of Armagh Prison smells to high heaven. Shall we turn our noses up?" Unsurprisingly, the article caused a stir and much public debate between feminist perspectives. Former Armagh prisoner Sheila Darragh wrote, "Most members of women's movements argued that the issue of Armagh was not an issue for them, that we were a part of a male-dominated organisation and therefore accepted the position of women in society as second class. We argued that nowhere were women struggling harder for women's rights than in Armagh, and how could we possibly have women's rights recognised in the absence of human and national rights? It's clear that for many women's rights activists on the outside, the attempt to balance their feminist views with their distaste for armed struggle saw their distaste prevail. Ultimately, they feared that to support Armagh as a feminist issue would be construed as support for the IRA. For the women in Armagh, it seemed, as Darragh writes, that it was trendy to be a liberated woman, but not a woman member of a liberation struggle. The women in Armagh released a statement in response to the rejection of their cause by feminists outside. In it they said, "If this is not a feminist issue, then we feel that the word feminist needs to be redefined to suit these people who feel that feminist applies to a certain section of women rather than encompassing women everywhere regardless of politically held views." But support did come from some corners. Each International Women's Day, for example, crowds would gather outside Armagh Jail and in Armagh City to show solidarity with those women. Nell McCafferty's emphasis on the unique risks for women on the No Wash protest is interesting to me. These same risks applied perhaps more acutely come the subsequent hunger strike. When Mary Doyle decided to join the hunger strike in 1980, she remembers thinking about wanting to have a child. "Supposing I survived," she said, "would I have become sterile through loss of weight?" As Eileen MacDonald explained, her conflict was a peculiarly female one, that her role as a fighter might endanger her future as a mother. I suspect these particular considerations weren't front of mind for their counterparts in Longkesh. And what of those who were mothers already and those who gave birth while imprisoned? 3 women gave birth in Armagh during the prison protests. Brenda Murphy, Jeannie Hamill and Bernadette Boyle. Not only were women handcuffed to the bed during labour, in each case the babies were removed after 6 weeks, signed out like pieces of property and handed over to family members. Prison rules actually stated that the women in this situation were permitted to keep their child with them for 12 months. But they didn't apply this to protesting prisoners. So the day Brenda Murphy handed over her child, the logbook read, 1 child, female, fair hair, blue eyes, £7.5. From that point on, prisoners were only allowed a half-hour visit with their child every 4 weeks. Participation in the prison protests also meant foregoing the possibility of early release. For those with young children, this was an enormous sacrifice to make and one with long-lasting ramifications. Sheila Darragh writes that in all cases, as time went on, the children found it hard to relate to their mothers. And so the women in Armagh were fighting on many fronts in a way their male counterparts were not. Not only were they a part of a nationalist struggle, but they also found themselves somewhat unwittingly at the centre of a feminist debate. And then there were the internal tensions, being caught between the steadfast commitment to a political cause and the desire in many cases to be mothers. On top of this, entrenched gender stereotypes saw them judged more harshly as either gender traitors, overly emotional victims of their own inherent weakness, or blind subordinates to the will of men. So far, I've spoken primarily about women as willing and active participants in armed conflict, women steeped in Republican politics and struggle. But what of those who found themselves involved for other reasons, the unlikely helpers and activists, some of whom no doubt felt thrust into these roles by circumstances or even by love? In particular here, I want to talk about mothers, but I'll also talk about sisters, girlfriends and wives. Many scholars and observers have concluded that the prison protests between 76 and 81 fundamentally changed the fortunes of the broader Republican movement. This is primarily because the events taking place within the prisons, particularly Long Kesh, made international news, catapulting the broader Republican struggle onto a global stage, attracting a sympathetic response from many parts of the world. With it came a flow of resources to the Republican movement, increased international diplomatic pressure on the British government, and the emergence of solidarity efforts, including here in Australia. Arguably, none of this would have been possible, though, without the actions of predominantly women across the 6 counties who formed Local Relatives Action Committees, RACs. These committees had 2 broad aims: to support and raise awareness about the plight of prisoners, and secondly, they provided a network through which these women could support each other. I want to focus on an RAC in Derry, and this RAC was founded by 4 women with relatives incarcerated in Long Kesh. They were their sons, husbands, brothers. These women formed their RAC in 1976. Mary Nealis was one of the founding members of this RAC. Her son was arrested and sentenced to 16 years imprisonment at just 18 years of age. And he was sentenced shortly after the removal of political prisoner status, which meant he went straight onto the protest when he went in. 25 years later, she recounted the experience in an on-for-blocked interview, saying, "We were catapulted into something that was full of human despair and was at the same time highly political. It's very difficult to marry the two, politics and human struggle, but this is what the RACs did." Another of Mary's sons would also be arrested and imprisoned in Long Kesh at just 17 years of age. In an effort to raise awareness about the conditions in Long Kesh during those protests, and feeling pretty much deserted by the church, Mary and a small number of others, there were 2 I believe, descended upon St Eugene's Cathedral on a freezing cold December day. They stripped naked, donned an old army blanket, carried placards and stood at the bishop's door in the rain. The response they received was as frosty as the weather. Mary stood crying as churchgoers hurled insults, but the protest gained media attention. Soon Mary was off to Philadelphia and then later to Europe to continue the awareness-raising campaign abroad. Mary Nealis, Josie Moore, Susie Coyle, Peggy McCool, Claire Bow and Eileen Harkin. These women and many others went all over Ireland wearing blankets, with nothing underneath, I might add as well. They were very authentic. They were followed by Special Branch, subjected to sometimes bruising strip searches and even excommunicated from the church. People who had been friends now ignored them on the street. Many, if not most, of those women and others who were involved in the RACs had no formal involvement in Republican politics or armed struggle. They were just mothers, sisters, wives and girlfriends. These women also bore the overwhelming burden of prison visits, a task that men, fathers in particular, largely avoided. This also meant these women became messengers, smuggling contraband and important communications in and out of the prisons. This might seem on its face a relatively low-level form of political involvement, but in order to make it through prison security undetected, the smuggling of contraband and comms necessarily involved acts of fairly extreme indignity, particularly for the working-class housewives of conservative Ireland. It was not for the faint-hearted. Women would hide items in their bras, their mouths, and to prevent detection in a strip search, often even their vaginal cavities. Younger women were used to visit male prisoners, people they may never have met before, in order to pass a comm from mouth to mouth in the course of an intimate kiss. Given that many prisoners would not have bathed in months or even years during the no-wash protest, an open-mouth kiss was likely to be rather unappealing for any woman. But women were dedicated to this task, and throughout the prison protest years, the operation was incredibly efficient. At its height, a message could be sent from a prisoner to the Republican leadership outside in the morning, and a response received later the same day. These visits also kept prisoners stocked with tobacco and biros, as well as the occasional crystal radio. The personal cost of this enterprise on women must have been significant. The security procedures for prison visits were lengthy and degrading, and the humiliation necessary to circumvent them must have been confronting. Then there was the distress of what greeted you at the end. Mary Nealis described visiting her son. His skin pale, maggots crawling through his hair, his lips open and raw with infection. Distressing for any mother. The activities of local RACs, Relatives Action Committees, gave rise eventually to the creation of the National H Block Armagh Committee, which provided a national coordination of this effort. And every opportunity to raise awareness was seized, from mayoral balls to embassy visits, and it was effective. The world began to watch and the outrage spread. Behind it all were ordinary women who, in Mary Nealis' own words, were dragged kicking and screaming into politics, and at great cost. But as she explained, women forced the issue right into the homes, into everyone's dinner table talk. Something that was never discussed before, now it was. It became commonplace, everyone's concern. That is what the involvement of women in the struggle did. The struggle came to be what it is, an issue of humanity. The stress on families of the blanket and no-wash protest only became more acute when it was announced that there would be a hunger strike. The first took place in 1980 when 7 prisoners in Long Kesh simultaneously joined the fast, later joined by the 3 women in Armagh. It was controversially called off after 53 days with no loss of life, but also no reinstatement of political status. For many prisoners, the disappointment of this first hunger strike rendered the 1981 hunger strike an inevitability. When the 1981 hunger strike was announced, the women in Armagh decided they would not participate, primarily to ensure that all attention was focused on the men in Long Kesh. Given the Republican movement objected to their participation in the first hunger strike, they were pretty relieved by this decision, as were the men in Long Kesh. In fact, Bobby Sands himself wrote to Mary Doyle in Armagh saying that he was delighted that no women were taking part. I could have given this presentation on the 1981 hunger strike alone, but in the interest of time, let me just make a couple of points. 10 men died on that hunger strike. Others were saved when their families authorised medical intervention, and eventually the hunger strike was called off. Many of those on the strike were married or had partners. Some had children, and most had mothers who were still alive. Families were under enormous pressure. They were under strict instruction from their son or husband to let them die. Meanwhile, the church was pressuring families to intervene once they were legally able to do so. For several hunger strikers, death was a painful, fitful affair, and families watched on, torn and helpless. For others, death came suddenly and families were denied that last goodbye altogether. In the case of Lawrence McEwen, at day 68 of his fast, he had the opportunity to apologise to his mother for the hurt he had caused her. She responded by saying that he had to do what he had to do and she had to do what she had to do. So for those last couple of days when his family were able to be present and when he was close to death, Margaret McEwen prayed quietly in an empty cell across the hall from her son and held her pain in, never letting it rush to the surface in his presence. At 70 days, Lawrence McEwen fell into a coma, as others had before him. Only Margaret, now that the decision had come to her, chose life for her son. And I'm sure that was a complex decision. I'm sure she wondered how he would feel about her decision if he survived it, which he did. Margaret McEwen wasn't at all political, and she was deeply, deeply respectful of authority. She had been dragged into politics, much like Mary Nealis, by circumstances beyond her control, and she was held there by her love for her child. Years before the hunger strike, when Lawrence was sentenced, she was given an opportunity by the judge to make a comment in his defence, and she would have been given no notice of this. Surrounded in the gallery by uniformed men, She said simply but lovingly, "He's my son." And in saying so little, she said it all. She humanised him. During the hunger strike, Margaret found herself speaking at events to advocate for her son. She had grown accustomed to prison visits, to the long commute, the waiting, the searches and the carrying of contraband. How far away that must have been from the world she knew. Women like Margaret very rarely have their stories told. They walk quietly through history, but with enormous impact. So why is it that many of the names I've mentioned today rarely rate a mention in any public discussion about the conflict in Ireland? Why is it that many men have been made heroes within their communities, while the equally significant contributions of women and the women themselves have largely remained invisible? It's part of a much bigger question that goes beyond just the experience in Ireland. As a Minister for Women, I'm constantly confronted with examples of women being written out of history. I also see it as part of my role to reverse that as much as possible in whatever setting. Today I've traversed some details of a conflict that will be uncomfortable to many. The people I have discussed will evoke very mixed feelings. Their activities will offend some and inspire others. But irrespective of where you sit, these are contributions and stories that should be understood. We can't hope to fully understand any conflict without better understanding the experience and motivations of those who take part in it. So much of our contemporary understanding comes from male experience. So if our understanding ultimately informs our response, including important policy responses, then I think it's fair to say that the omission of women's perspectives can only lead to very poor responses indeed, as it did in the Irish conflict. So bringing forward from the shadows women's stories and their unique experience is not just about equity for the sake of it. It should never be regarded as merely symbolic or as an act of appeasement to the dastardly feminists among us, of which I am one. It's about filling dangerous gaps in our understanding, and most of all, it's about delivering better outcomes, better responses, and through this, safer, fair and more inclusive communities. So in my view, we must tell these stories. We must build an understanding of these experiences, even if it challenges us, even if we have reservations about the individuals, their cause or their tactics. From St Brigit of Kildare to the women in Armagh, from Mary Neillis to Margaret McEwen, we must tell these stories. Thank you.